el corazón de la salsa. The bass. Aha. Woo. From Europe, Europa, the 88s, el piano.
The Montgomery family is one of the greatest families in jazz when it comes to their legacy and their contribution to the music. Even many casual jazz listeners are familiar with Wes Montgomery, probably the greatest and most influential guitarist of his generation. His younger brother, Buddy, had a significant career playing vibes and piano with Wes and the likes of Johnny Griffin, the Master Sounds, and others. But the oldest brother, Monk, has a unique place in the history of jazz and is one of the most overlooked bass players in the history of the music. By all accounts, he was one of the first significant bass players to play the electric bass guitar in jazz, and is probably the first person to ever record on that instrument. We'll get into that later. In a legacy that quickly came to be dominated by names like Jamerson, McCartney, and Rainey, Monk Montgomery's name is often overlooked. Let's check out Monk Montgomery. William Howard Monk Montgomery was born on October 10th, 1921 in Indianapolis, Indiana. The Montgomery family was a very musical one. In addition to Wes and Buddy, there was an older brother named Thomas that played the drums, and a younger sister named Irvina that also played piano. Monk himself gifted his brother his first guitar in about 1934 or 1935. Compared to his younger brothers, Monk would be considered a late comer to the bass. There's no public mention of his bass playing until 1948, when he was well into his 20s. That's when he was noted in the paper for playing with an Indianapolis group called the Bebop Society. In January of 1953, in his 30s, Monk Montgomery took the job as the bass player for the great vibraphonist Lionel Hampton, following in the footsteps of his brother Wes, who also played in Lionel Hampton's band earlier. By taking the gig, Monk would in effect inherit a new instrument that Lionel was using with his band at the time. Now, this kind of puts to bed the whole was Monk the first jazz bass player to use an electric bass? Because he wasn't. He was replacing someone who was an electric bass player before him. I actually found an article from the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the nation's great old black newspapers. And the article is from May of 1952, well before Monk Montgomery joined him. But it's really fascinating to read about what people thought of this crazy new instrument. Check this out. Lionel Hampton features unusual new instrument. Lionel Hampton, always on the look-see for something new in the way of modern sound, has given a heavier, fuller tone to his tremendous orchestra with the introduction of the Fender bass, a new electronic instrument destined to replace the popular bass. Roy Johnson, Hampton's top-ranked bassist, becomes the first member of a big band to play the instrument developed in California by a Fullerton instrument company. That would be Fender. Johnson, who hails from Kansas City, discovered the instrument while listening to a small trio in a California nightclub last fall. The instrument looks like a freakish conception of an electric guitar. It is played somewhat like a guitar, although it is strummed instead of plucked. Roy, although having just acquired the instrument in November, is already experimenting with new tonal effects. Although the instrument cannot be bowed like the bass violin, which it replaces, a bowing effect can be created through certain fingering techniques. Johnson is one of the first musicians to play this instrument, which is expected to replace the rather cumbersome bass violin, so popular with modern dance bands. When Monk joined the band, Lionel wanted this instrument to be played. Some embraced this change. The great jazz critic Leonard Feather called it a sensational instrumental innovation in 1952. But as you can hear from the language of the article, there was some hesitation, including from Monk himself, about this new instrument. But he persevered. Hamp handed me the Fender and told me he wanted the electric instrument sound in the band. The electric bass was considered a bastard instrument. Conventional bass players despised it. It was new and a threat to what they knew. At first I freaked out because I was in love with my upright bass, but I made up my mind to do it, and I did it well. Monk Montgomery would initially model his technique after his brother Wes. You can see in early pictures he's playing the instrument with his thumb, but he applied his jazz acumen and his deep influence from players like Jimmy Blanton, Ray Brown, and Charles Mingus. In July of 1953, he took part in what many consider to be the first ever recordings on the electric bass guitar. Starting in 1955, the Montgomery brothers started recording together and making records, with Wes on guitar, Buddy Montgomery on vibes and piano, and Monk playing electric and double bass. And in 1957, Monk would join a group led by his brother Buddy and record several albums with the Master Sounds. In the 1960s, he switched to playing a Fender jazz bass with a felt pick, a technique you can see thoroughly described in his 1978 bass method book. Monk also made records with an early version of the Jazz Crusaders in 1964 and 1965, and as we turn into the 70s, he was making gigs with the likes of Cal Tjader, Hugh Masekela, and Red Norvo. Between 1969 and 1975, he recorded 4 albums as a leader on electric bass. Now I know that Bass Odyssey is one of the more popular of Monk's albums that's resurfaced over the years, and it's for good reason. It's a great record. It's one of the earliest examples of this kind of lead bass playing that we've become really used to today. But it's not my favorite. If I had to pick one, I'd have to say it would be 1974's Reality. Produced on the Philadelphia International record label, it features their stellar in-house rhythm section, including the great Ronnie Baker on bass, but also those incredible, beautiful, lush Philly soul string arrangements backing up Monk playing melodies on the bass guitar. They even do a cover of label mate Billy Paul's hit record Me and Mrs. Jones. And Monk's version of the jazz standard Girl Talk that closes the album is not to be missed. He settled in Las Vegas in the 1970s, becoming not only an active member of that jazz community, but a huge advocate for that scene and for the musicians that played in Las Vegas. He died in 1982 of cancer. In the grand scheme of jazz, the music of Monk Montgomery unfortunately goes largely unknown and uncredited. Now, he may not have brought the Fender bass to the table, but there's no doubt that he gave it legitimacy and a credible voice, both as a sideman and as a soloist. Like his book, most of his records are out of print, and while he tends to be overshadowed by many of his peers, we have to acknowledge that Monk Montgomery is one of the true founding fathers of the electric bass guitar. So check him out if you haven't. Thanks for watching the video. Do you have a favorite Monk?
Well, the most important pointer that my father taught me when I'm playing, if I don't feel it, don't play it. And, you know, a lot of guys would just play straight and with no feeling, but he would play like. You know, put something in it. He just felt life, you know, that life was music. And he used to tell this story like this one song he did. He saw a fat woman walking down the street and just her butt going from boom to boom to boom, ba-dum, ba-dum. That was his interpretation of music. So he put music to just about anything that had life to it. There's an indentation right here in the bass where he kept his thumb right here as a rest. That's how old this bass is. So you can see all the dirt on here. As he says, the dirt keeps the funk. This has been the original bass ever since he started playing, before he switched over to precision. He used this on Heat Wave, My Guys, Shop Around, most of the Mary Wells stuff. You Beat Me to the Punch, some other earlier stuff with Stevie. He played with one finger on all those hits, just like this finger was called the hook. And it would hook like this. All the songs that you heard basically was done with one finger. I have trouble playing with two fingers the line that he played, so.
You couldn't even touch his timing because he could hear another time in his head and be playing cut time against what you're playing, and it would fit.
There was never a bass player on no coast then. If that was a West Coast, East Coast, whatever coast you want to call it, that was comparable to a James Jamerson.
It's the height of creativity, you know, and freedom and experimentation and fearlessness. You have to be absolutely fearless to play those notes in that place and and yet be responsible for the bottom of the groove like that.
I thought bass playing was played like that all the time. But little did I know that it was my father changing the course of bass.
Riffs are distinctive little nuggets of tune which might begin a song or form the basis of a section of a song. There are hundreds of incredibly well-known riffs in popular music, like these. In some bass riffs, there's an unmistakable feeling that we're waiting for something else to happen, for the voice to soar in over the top, for the key to change, for the drums to join in, or the guitar to begin a solo. There are other examples of bass solos being much more than that. Post-war jazz saw the appearance of virtuoso bassists in small bands whose role was far from that of supporting stooge. Miles Davis's So What, from his influential 1959 album Kind of Blue, features a bass solo from Paul Chambers that underpins and shapes the whole piece. Jazz bass players' attitude to their role, that they were no longer mere bricks and mortar for the other players to stand on, was to redefine what we expect as listeners from bass in contemporary music. In 60s pop music, the most influential bass playing came from the house band of Tamla Motown, the Funk Brothers. Its bass maestro was the great James Jamerson. Most, if not all of you, will know the 1967 Marvin Gaye hit, I Heard It Through the Grapevine. But it was first recorded for Tamla by Gladys Knight and the Pips. And what gave that original recording such energy and drive was the way James Jamerson played the bass line. Take the chorus, for example, which is based on just two simple chords, C and F. Now, an unimaginative bass player would simply thrash out the roots of those chords one after another, like this. But Jamerson turns the bass line into a fireball, leaping about all over the place to create movement and excitement in the accompaniment. By giving such life to the bass line, Jamerson turned the bass from a meek accompanying instrument into a chief ingredient in the success of hit songs.
One of the big things that became huge attraction for me was when I started listening to the bass on the records, and in particular James Jamerson. And you realize you do, and well, that's the record.
I've got sunshine on a cloudy day.
But that that's the signature, you know, of Motown. So yeah, I think James is probably my favorite bass player ever.
I guess you say, what can make me feel this way, my girl, my girl, my girl.
Arguably one of the most influential bass players of all time, revolutionizing the role of the bass guitar and changing the landscape of popular music forever. He was the unsung hero behind 23 #1 hits on the pop charts, 56 R&B #1 hits, and ranking #1 on the 50 greatest bass players of all time according to Rolling Stone magazine. His bass lines on songs like My Girl by The Temptations, You Can't Hurry Love by The Supremes, and What's Going On by Marvin Gaye are still considered some of the most iconic bass parts in the history of popular music. His contributions to Motown's legendary sound have earned him a reputation as a true pioneer of the electric bass guitar, and he continues to inspire bass players and musicians from around the world. This is the life and story of James Jamerson. James Lee Jamerson was born on January 29, 1936 in Charleston, South Carolina. He was one of 12 children. As a child, Jamerson learnt to play gospel, blues and jazz music on the radio. Even though Jamerson was quite reserved and quiet as a teenager, he was so passionate about music that he actually got to the level where he was good enough to perform in public. This passion for music was probably due to the fact that he was partly raised by his grandmother, who played piano, and his aunt, who sang in the church choir. In 1954, Jamerson moved with his mother to Detroit and attended Northwestern High School. Now, we know Jamerson for his iconic electric bass playing, but in high school, he actually studied the double bass. While at high school, Jamerson began playing at the local blues and jazz clubs in the Detroit area, and he was heavily influenced by jazz double bass players such as Ray Brown, Paul Chambers, and Percy Heath. After graduating from high school, he joined blues singer Washboard Willie's band, and because of his solid reputation from performing in the Detroit clubs, he later toured with Jackie Wilson. After becoming one of the most sought-after session musicians in Detroit's thriving music scene, he managed to find steady work at Berry Gordy's Hottsville, USA studio, home of the Motown record label. This is when Jamerson's career really started to take off. In the early 1960s, Jamerson began working with Motown Records. There he became a member of a core group of studio musicians called the Funk Brothers. Like Jamerson, most of the Funk Brothers were jazz musicians. In the daytime, they would record in this small basement studio which they called the Snake Pit due to all the cable runs out the ceiling. And then in the evening, they would perform at the jazz clubs. They did occasionally tour the US with Motown artists, but for most of their career, this was their schedule: session work in the day, jazz clubs at night. During the 1960s, this close-knit group of musicians performed on countless hit records from Motown artists including the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, the Temptations, and so much more. But the sad thing is the Funk Brothers, including James Jamerson, were never credited on any of the songs or albums. Their pay was considerably less than the main artists, so occasionally they would have to find freelance work elsewhere to pay the bills. But as Jamerson was quickly becoming one of the most in-demand bass players in the industry, his reputation eventually earned him a retainer for $1,000 a week, which is roughly $8,000 in today's money. Now he could afford a very comfortable lifestyle for himself and his family. But how did James Jamerson grow to become one of the most iconic bass players of all time, developing an immediately recognizable sound that everyone came to know and love, even influencing music legends such as Marcus Miller, John Patitucci, Anthony Jackson, Geddy Lee, Sting, and Paul McCartney? Well, in this next part of the story, let's dive deeper into James Jamerson's style and sound. When Jamerson first started working in the studio, his earliest sessions were performed on the double bass, but in the early 1960s he switched to playing the electric bass guitar. When Jamerson made this transition to the electric bass, it was a relatively new instrument and it was not well established. So Jamerson developed his own way of playing the instrument, and he became known for playing the iconic Fender Precision bass. If you listen to James Jamerson's bass playing, you'll be able to hear influences of his early days of playing double bass in the jazz clubs and then applying that to his session work in the studio playing electric bass. There are 5 things that define Jamerson's sound and his background as a jazz musician and upright bassist and how it influenced his electric bass playing style. Number 1, he frequently used open strings, like here in What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. Instead of Jamerson playing the note A on the 5th fret of the E string, here, he's playing with an open A string, which is a common thing to do as a double bass player for intonation reasons. Number 2, one aspect of Jamerson's upright playing that carried over to his electric bass guitar playing was the fact that he generally used only his right index finger to pluck the strings. So if I just show you what that looks like on the electric bass, as you can see here, I've got my right index finger in the plucking hand, and he would just use this one finger to play all the lines. You're going to have to do raking as well if you're going to want to incorporate this technique into your bass playing. But he's really just using that one index finger. This style of playing with just the one index finger is more of a double bass technique. Jamerson became famous for playing with just one finger, and his index finger even earned its own nickname, the hook. Check out the hook in action in this video of Jamerson playing live with Marvin Gaye. Number 3, Jamerson used Labella heavy gauge flat wound strings, which he never replaced unless he broke a string. He did not particularly take care of his instruments, as he once said, "The dirt keeps the funk." And the neck on his P bass started to bend, and while this made it more difficult to fret, Jamerson believed it improved the quality of the tone. Now Jamerson liked a really warm sound with the volume control on his P bass turned all the way up full, and then the treble or the tone was actually halfway. On most of his studio recordings, his bass was just plugged directly in with no pedals or effects. Check out this isolated clip of Jamerson's bass playing and listen to his warm round P bass sound. Number 4, Jamerson's bass lines relied heavily on chromatic runs, syncopation, ghost notes, and inversions, which contrasted with popular music of the time. In the 1950s and 60s, R&B, rock and roll, and country bass lines were a lot simpler and less rhythmically and harmonically complex. Check out Jamerson's more complex melodic runs, syncopated rhythms, and deep sense of groove in this 1967 recording of Bernadette by the Four Tops. Number 5, as Motown's founder Berry Gordy said, Jamerson was an incredible improviser. Jamerson probably developed his improvisational skills back in the Detroit jazz clubs. This knowledge of improvisation gave him the ability to be very creative and versatile in the studio, and he was able to look at basic chord charts and create a masterpiece. Over time, his technique and improvisational approach became a lot more nuanced and more developed. During Jamerson's time at Motown Records, he played on
Hey, how's it going? Scott here from SBL, and today we're going to be talking about one of the most legendary bass players of all time, the amazing James Jamerson. Now, most of you will be probably familiar with Jamerson's work, you know, like he recorded with everybody, like Stevie Wonder, Martha and the Vandellas, Marvin Gaye, Edwin Starr, Jackie Wilson, the Four Tops, the Supremes, the Temptations, Smokey Robinson, and Diana Ross, and a ton of other people. Like, if you listen to tracks such as like My Girl, Heard It Through the Grapevine, You Can't Be Loved, Science Delivered, Papa Was a Rolling Stone, Tears of a Clown, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, all of that was James Jamerson and obviously the session band, the Funk Brothers. In fact, it is claimed that the Funk Brothers have played on more hit records, in fact, more #1 hits than the Beatles, Elvis Presley, the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys combined. But what was it about James Jamerson that ended up making him legendary? What was it about his bass lines and his bass line construction that made record companies postpone recording dates until they could get him on it? Because they believed that his bass lines had a really high contributing factor to that record being a hit, okay? If you think about it, it's a really unique thing to happen. First and foremost, I think that we need to consider that James Jamerson was a piano player when he was a kid, and he really understood chord structure, and we can hear that in his bass lines. He was a piano player, but secondly, he was a jazz player. He'd been playing in his jazz high school band. He'd been playing with jazz stars around Detroit on the upright bass, and then he began to get those skills and apply them to the electric bass. And for me, he was one of the first guys that did that, and it is really easy to overlook how amazing he was at bassline construction and outlining the chords. He had complete mastery of it. In fact,
unknown to the world, one man was quietly crafting a bass sound that would outlive all of Detroit's production lines. When I was just starting, I was playing maybe 5-6 months. I didn't know who the great bass players were because nobody put their names on the records. But one kid came up to me at CBGB's and he knew. He said, "Hey, you know the way you use your thumb and forefinger? That's just like James Jamerson." I said, "Who?" Jamerson, who played on the majority of early Motown records, was key to their unique sound. But like all of their studio players, he remained uncredited and invisible.
James Jamerson created a groove which the rest of the musicians rode on. He was the foundation, and other players vibrated with. Everyone else made up their parts based on what James was doing.
I guess you say what can make me feel this way, my girl.
They incorporate the rhythm with the melodic part as well. He could have just gone dun. He could just play the dun, 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 dun. But he chose to do something that you feel the rhythm in it as well. He brought like the two elements together.
Jamerson's bass with big flat wound strings, and there was a foam mute installed in Fenders at the time that would mute the strings. They don't make them like that anymore, so now you can just stick a piece of air conditioning foam in to get that muted, muffled sound. And then the key to the sound is never touching it beyond that. I bought this years ago, and I haven't cleaned it or done anything because you just let it ferment.
For once in my life, I have someone who needs me, someone I've needed so long.
He didn't change his bass strings. And so they got that little muddy, muffled sound. And so the notes didn't last long. Because the notes didn't last long, it forced him to play more of a rhythmic feel to the bass. His bass playing got then he just found in between the grooves and just started a style that nobody had ever done before.
Oh, someone warm like you would make my dream come true. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What makes a hit record a hit? It feels good. He just made those feel good, you know, the way he's playing. A little short guy, the bass was bigger than him, you know. It's unbelievable. Just a touch is what made it so special.
I Was Made to Love Her, you know, that initial sweep that you have to play really fast. no mountain high enough. His lines are taking these peaks and valleys. I did a bass line thing online so you can see it.
Listen, baby, ain't no mountain high, ain't no valley low, ain't no river wide enough, baby.
This was the advent of soul music, and Motown was soul music.
Don't worry, baby.
It had to be almost orchestral, but using rock instruments.
Oh, baby, there ain't no mountain high enough.
He climbs when the other instruments are diving, and then he completely descends and drops under the vocal.
The first song we sent to Motown was Ain't No Mountain High Enough. We just knew it was a hit. You know, the song had so many levels.
I made a vow, I'll be there when you want me some way, somehow. Oh, baby, there ain't no mountain high enough.
James Jamerson was a quiet genius. You didn't have to tell him anything. He instantly knew the feeling that you were going after.
We've got to find a way to bring some understanding here today. Make it light.
Jamerson didn't just come to define the Motown sound, he kind of invented funk bass.
The first slap bass riff ever recorded. Before the invention of the bass guitar, what was known as slap bass sounded like this. Then along came the bass as we know it today, and players either plucked with their thumbs, their fingers, or a pick. That was until Larry Graham recorded with this new technique in 1969, and the rest was history.
And we would all contribute to the lead lines. Sly would sing a line, I would sing a line, usually always the low, I'm gonna add some bottom. We all had our own musical background and experiences that we were allowed to contribute to the band. So everybody brought something to the table.
You might like to hear my organ. I said, right.
Although Sly was the writer, musically he would allow us to express ourselves. And I think that that really helped the band to be kind of like a melting pot of music, so to speak.
It was this openness to new ideas that allowed Larry Graham to go wild with his bass. He invented a new style of playing that would become one of the sounds most associated with funk. Slap bass.
Fingers start shaking. I began to run.
It was a technique he developed playing with his mum as a kid.
My mom decided that we weren't going to have drums anymore. Now, I don't know if that was for economic reasons or what. Maybe two people could make more than divided it up among three. She never told me the reason, but we're not going to have drums anymore. So that's when I started thumping the strings with my thumb to make up for not having that bass drum, and plucking the strings with my finger to make up for not having that backbeat on the snare drum. So it's kind of playing the drums on the bass.
Mama so happy. I start to cry.
After Thank You for Letting Me, that became a huge template for every bass player to start using the thumb slap.
You talk about a song being written around a bass riff, that was it.
Later on, other bands, if you were going to play some serious funk, you kind of had to have the bass player play my style of playing the bass.
Thank You was a #1 record that became a cornerstone of the funk. The way the bass riff left space for the rest of the band to fill in the groove showed the next generation of Funketeers how to construct a hit song out of a jam.
The more space sometimes that you leave between the 2 and the 4, and if you just play that continuously and let it just brew on the same groove over and over and over and over again until it gets so powerful, that is ridiculous. That's like the kind of funk that I like. And then you make the ugly face. That's funky.
What's that?
Larry Graham. You're the first bass player that we heard on the radio doing that thump thing. What gave you the idea to start doing that?
Well, I have to tell you a little story if you don't mind.
Sure.
It kind of goes back a few years to when I was about 14, 15 years old. We had a little duo, Moms and I. And for a while, I had my drummer playing with us, little trio, but that didn't work so well, so we went duo. But see, the thing of it is after we didn't have drums, it caused a problem. See, I kind of miss not having that backbeat and that snare drum, so I had to kind of compensate. But now, interesting, see, I came to the bass from the guitar, and we had an old organ in the club, and I used to play the bass with my foot, see, while I was playing the guitar. But now, since it was like a duo, and we didn't have that organ, I went and rented me a bass. In the meantime, till we get to get the organ fixed. But the organ was too old; it couldn't be fixed. So I ended up keeping the bass, and then when we ended up without the drummer, I started thumping to make up for not having a bass drum. Right? Okay, so that kind of made it for the bass drum. But now the snare drum thing, I had to compensate for that too. So I did a little thumping in the plucking line. Every day I have the blues and things like that, you know. And so this went on for a while. And it was interesting. There was this lady that used to listen to my mother and I all the time. She used to come in the club and request songs, and we play them, and she became a fan. And so she was also at the same time a fan of this young man who was a disc jockey on KSOL in San Francisco. His name was Sly Stone. So she found out he was going to start a band, right? And so she said, you got to go down and hear this bass player. His name is Larry Graham. Go check him out because you might want him in your band. So he did. He came in. He liked what I was doing. Asked me to start playing in his group. Got the name Sly and the Family Stone. Went in the studio. And the first thing we did is a little something like this. Dance to the music. So that the dancers just won't hide. And that's how that got started, you know what I mean? And then a little time passed. We went in the studio and did a little thing where I got a chance to feature my thumping and plucking. A little song called, well, it was really to thank everybody for the first hit. And I got a chance to thump and pluck on a little thank you like this. They, ah. Now, you might want to ask me a little something about that.
You're pulling with more than one finger on that.
Right. Check it out. Thumb, thumb, thumb. And then you add the finger thing here. And there. See, it's important to pull it and get that little snap on it, you know.
It was a Sony. And the most important part, it had bass, it had big bottom, and that was everything we were looking for. We could listen to dance music. It was like you had your own private, personal club. In 1979, the summer I got that boombox, all music styles blossomed. Bass-heavy disco was huge. And there was one group who supercharged it and laid a foundation for hip-hop with the perfect bassline breakdown.
3 on E. Everybody knows about 3 on E, right? I mean, Another One Bites the Dust, Hollywood Swingin'. Like, if you want to get people moving, just take the lowest string and hit it 3 times.
Good Times was maybe our greatest bass line. For many years, we had been trying to put walking bass lines in songs. And I guess that's probably because of my jazz background. This particular day, Bernard came to the studio late. And he says, our engineer at the time, he said, hey man, what's going on? What's that? And he said, I don't know, that's something Niall came up with last night or this morning or something. I don't know, but all the guys are playing it. So Bernard just plugged in and he was copying me. So I was playing. So he was probably going. That sounded okay. But then I just screamed, walk, walk, walk. And for no reason other than the fact that we had been trying it 1,000,000 times. And he went, doom, doom, doom. Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. And it just felt amazing to us. And I screamed to the engineer, I said, make it red. And we just recorded it, first take, and it was right.
With Bernard Edwards, he claimed he could never hold on to a pick. but he would play like he had a pick in his hands. And you get this bizarre sound of when you're going down, it hits the fingernail. And when you're going up, it hits the pad of the finger.
His whole chucking thing, it's really hard to play. Let me see. Play it again. Something like that. I'll try it again. That's not bad. So it's a mixture of using the finger as a pick and using regular traditional bass fingering at the same time.
And that used to always amaze me and amaze other bass players because they thought he had a pick, but that was his technique.
Which I haven't seen anyone even do to this day.
And it was so complicated, I just decided to go.
But Chic's bass-heavy breakdowns weren't just innovative. They were key to their success and their legacy.
It worked with every crowd, with the newly growing hip-hop crowd because we had amazing breakdowns. It worked with the super funkers because our music was always different, jazzy bass lines. All of our hit records had that melodic bass breakdown. That was the Chic magic. So we wrote up on the wall and we kept this motto for all time. A song is an excuse to go to a chorus, and a chorus is an excuse to go to the breakdown. Period. That's our philosophy.
Slap in the bass continued to grow within the 70s, and a huge pioneer was Stanley Clarke. While Larry Graham and others were making slap a staple of funk and disco music, Stanley Clarke was a pioneer for finding its way into the jazz and fusion genres. What made Stanley unique was his capability on both the electric and the upright. Stanley had made a name for himself with pianist Chick Corea. The group returned to Forever, but it was in 1976 where his solo album School Days became a legendary "you have to know this if you're a bass player" album. His use of strumming chords, aggressive fingerstyle technique, three-finger technique, in combination to his incredible slapping, made him stand out greatly and is a legend.
You know, the first thing we have as a bass player is the sound. The sound is everything we have. You have to find out what sound that you want to be represented by. I happen to have that, you know. That when people hear this note or these notes, you know, the first thing that comes to them is my sound, it's my notes, my bass. I'm on that record.
If you go back in jazz history, eventually somewhere you're going to get to Ron Carter. How can you have an interest in jazz and not pay attention to Ron Carter? He's in the Guinness Book of World Records for being on the most recordings. I mean, there's just no way.
Every bass player today, whether they know it, like it, or whatever, when you play jazz bass, there's a bit of Ron Carter in everyone.
These are ones where I'm the leader on most of these up here specifically. Me and Bill Frisell, me and Eric Gale, me and Bach. Some of them since 1960.
thousands and thousands and thousands of people calling Ron to play on a record. It didn't happen by accident.
McCoy Tyner,
Herbie Hancock,
Aretha Franklin,
So long, baby.
Paul Simon,
Roberta Flack.
Killing me softly with his song, killing me softly.
Gil Scott-Heron.
The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution.
A Tribe Called Quest.
Yeah. And this one goes out to my man. Thanks a lot, Ron Carter. On the bass, yes, my man Ron Carter is on the bass.
All the great players have an individual sound. You can identify Ron if you hear some music for a few moments. Listen, oh yeah, that's Ron Carter.
Are you surprised they took that?
Not a surprise to me.
Man, I started a whole new era of hip hop.
You in town yet?
Ron, to me personally, has always been somewhat of an enigma. Not because he makes himself that way, but that's just how it feels. You know what I mean? Like, there's every other great bass player that I've admired and looked up to, and then there's Ron Carter, right?